Hi folks, thanks for joining. My name is Dennis. Recently, Harbor Freight released a new K-body parallel clamp called the Bremen. I picked up a couple to see how they perform and how they compare. Stay with me and I'll walk you through what I found. So from an orientation perspective, I've got the Harbor Freight Bremen on the left-hand side, the Bessey on the right-hand side, and they're both 24-inch clamps. And with the exception of the configuration of the lower jaw, visually, they're pretty similar. And more than that, many of the measurements are virtually the same across the two clamps. The height and width of the upper jaw is virtually the same. The height and width of the rails are virtually the same. And the width of the pads, the lower jaw, are virtually the same. Some of the differences are that there's a little bit extra distance in the throat of the Harbor Freight. The rail is about an inch longer. And on the Bessey side, the handle is a little bit longer than the Harbor Freight and it's a little bit wider. But other than that, the configuration is very similar. So now let's take a look at some of the similar features between the two clamps. Both clamps have workpiece supports that prevent the workpiece from coming into contact with the rail. And both clamps have feet at the bottom of the rail in order to keep the end of the clamp in plane with the upper and lower jaws. The upper jaws of both clamps have a slight cant downwards towards the lower jaw. And on the Bessey site, they indicate that the clamp should normally be what they call, quote, toe in when at rest or under minimal pressure. And the clamp is not calibrated to be at 90 degrees at all times. Under pressure, the intent is for the jaws to align to be parallel. So in this case, it looks like the Harbor Freight clamp is aligning to that approach as well. So here's an example of the cant that we just talked about. You can see how the lower jaw is flush with the material. The upper jaw, the toe, is touching the material, but the upper or the inside portion of the upper jaw is not. And as I start to tighten down, you can see how the jaws become parallel. Here's an example with the Harbor Freight. Same situation. You see the lower jaw is flush with the material, the upper jaw, only the toe is touching, and as I go ahead and tighten down, you can see how the jaws become parallel. Both clamps have the ability to be used as spreaders. With the Harbor Freight, you'd remove the foot at the bottom. Go ahead and remove the lower jaw. And just slide it back on again in the opposite direction. And I find it's much easier to insert the lower jaw in the opposite direction by standing the clamp up on its upper jaw and inserting the lower jaw onto the rail again in the opposite direction. And lastly, in terms of similarities, both clamps are made in China. Okay, let's talk about some of the differences between the two clamps. The thing that strikes me most when looking at both clamps is the finish on the rails. And you could see that the Bessey clamp has a smooth, polished finish, whereas the Harbor Freight Bremen has a rough, dull finish. And based upon the little knowledge I have around steel fabrication, there are three ways to fabricate steel: cold rolled method, cold drawn method, and hot rolled method. And Bessey uses the cold drawn method, which is the most complex of all three, but results in a greater tensile strength, which means that it's going to resist deforming and breaking under tension. And it also results in this polished finish as well. And that leads me to believe, again, based upon my initial analysis, that the Harbor Freight Bremen model is fabricated using the hot rolled method. That results in this type of finish. It's also a less complex in terms of process to fabricate the steel that way, and it also results in a tensile strength that is not as great as the cold rolled methods or the cold drawn method. So that could account for certainly differences in price. In terms of strength, the only thing I have that can give me an indication of the difference between tensile strength between the cold and hot methods is the advertising material. The Harbor Freight Bremen has a clamping force of up to 1,300 pounds, whereas the Bessey has a clamping force, an everyday clamping force of up to 1,700 pounds. So That gives you some indication of what the differences are in how that steel is fabricated and produced. Another important difference between the two clamps are these pins on the Bessey. These pins are drilled directly through the rail and provide a really tight integration between the upper jaw and the rail for increased stability. And I don't see that on the Harbor Freight Bremen model. There is a pin here that I removed in the hopes of opening this back door to see what's inside, but I was unable to do so. The pin is too far to the left. It doesn't go through the rail itself. And the only thing I could think of is that if I look at both lower jaws, both in the Bessey and the Harbor Freight, there are pins on either side of the rail going in this direction and on this side in this direction. My only guess is that the Harbor Freight model employed that same approach in the upper jaw. And the only way I'll be able to find out is if we hear something from the manufacturer, or if I'm able to open up the upper jaw at some point to verify what's going on there. But for now, it doesn't look like that tight integration is that the Bessey has is incorporated into the Harbor Freight Bremen model. But again, that's only my guess since I'm not able to look inside. Another difference between the two clamps is the hex key at the bottom of the Bessey handle. And that's used to actually add additional clamping force, or it's used by people who have issues with wrist strength. Another difference I found between the two clamps is the anti-slide capability of the Bessey clamp. I could hold it upright like that and the lower jaw will remain in place. I could turn it upside down and the lower jaw remains in place as well. And I don't find that same capability in the Harbor Freight. It'll hold its position if I hold it upright like this, but if I turn it upside down, that jaw will just start to slide right down. Something to be aware of. So what I'd like to do now is to run some comparative tests to determine whether or not the jaws stay parallel when under tension. And here I've got some 1 or 2 inch maple using the Bessey clamps and tighten down pretty hard. And if I move the square over to the upper jaw, you can see some daylight where the jaw meets the material. And to try to gauge how much of a distance that is, I'll use my Starrett blade and see if I could zero in on that. That looks like about a 64th, which isn't bad at all, very acceptable. Now I'll try that with the Harbor Freight clamps. And here I've got the same setup with the Harbor Freight clamps tightened down pretty hard. And if I move a square to the upper jaw, again you can see a little daylight towards the bottom where the jaw meets the material. I'll try to measure that out again as well. And that looks to be not quite a 32nd. So that's pretty good considering this is the Harbor Freight model. That's pretty impressive actually. Okay, so here I'm looking to see how much the bar deflects under tension, and I'm using the Bessey clamps first. Okay, so that's about a 1/16 of an inch or 0.063. Let's see how the Harbor Freight does. Okay, and here's the Harbor Freight. Tightening it down now. Trying to make sure I exert the same amount of pressure. So that deflection measures not quite 3/32. I'm looking at 5/64, which comes to 0.078. So the difference between the two, the Bessey and the Harbor Freight, is 0.015, less than a sheet of paper. It's pretty impressive for Harbor Freight. So here I'm just joining up 2 pieces of pine. I just want to see how the clamps react under pressure in terms of the joint line, if there's any bowing and so forth. So let's tighten these up. and I'm making them fairly snug. Nice and flat. Right now I'm looking to see if there's any gaps between the board and the rails. I'm not seeing any on that side. And I'm not seeing any on that side. So these are the Bessey clamps, and these, as expected, perform pretty well. Typically I would put another clamp in the center, but this is just for informational purposes. I'll do the same scenario with the Harbor Freight clamps. Tighten them up fairly snug. Nice and flat. I want to make sure that there's no gaps between the wood and the rail. And this one looks pretty good. And this side looks pretty good as well. One more test. I wanted to see the amount of deflection in the jaws when thinner material is clamped between the jaws. So if I move the square over, you can see some daylight at the bottom of the jaw where it meets the work material. And if I measure that out, that looks to be about a 30-second. And I want to just compare that to the Harbor Freight. Here's the Harbor Freight. I've got that clamped down pretty well as well. And if I move the square there, you'd also see some daylight between the clamp and the bottom of the square. And if I look to measure that distance, it's slightly more than a 30-second. It's not a 16th, but it's slightly more than a 30-second. Pretty respectable. So we covered a lot of territory, and I have to say that I'm really surprised and impressed with the quality of the Harbor Freight clamps. I put them through a lot of tests over the past couple days, comparing them to the Besseys, and I have to say that they performed really well within small tolerances when compared against each other. That's pretty impressive. The question is going to be, would you recommend them for purchase? And the answer is going to be, it depends. It depends upon the work that you do, the budget that you have, and your tolerance for risk. If budget wasn't an issue, I'd go with the Besseys. Why? Because they've been around for decades, and I know the clamps last for decades. The clamps you see behind me are all 15 plus years old, so that I know that if I make an investment in Bessey, they're going to be with me for a long time. We're not sure about that with the Harbor Freight, right? It's a relatively new product. It's got 2 reviews on the website last time I checked, and it's got no track record, so we don't know how it's going to perform over the long term. I think Harbor Freight realizes that, and they've actually offered a lifetime guarantee with this product, which really mitigates the fact that there's no track record for the product and makes a purchase of this product very attractive. So I would feel comfortable recommending these depending upon your circumstances. I've purchased 4 of these. I intend to keep them, to use them, and I'm curious to see how they perform over the long term. I'm hopeful that I have them for a number of years to come, but if I don't, I'll be taking advantage of that lifetime guarantee. Anyway, I hope this helps. I hope it was informative in helping you make any decisions you may be thinking about regarding clamps, and I will see you next time. Take care.